Shields, TINLDS.
And your title?
I'm the water manager at Imperial Irrigation District.
Okay. Talk to me about the Salton Sea. We're doing a long series on this, focusing on past, present, future. IID's had a really long history. We've watched all these documentaries on it. You guys have been around since 1900, 1901, is that right?
Early 1900s, yeah.
Early 1900s. Talk to me about the issue with the Salton Sea. We know it's a looming ecological crisis. What is this crisis as IID understands it?
So historically, the Salton Sea is the drainage basin for the Imperial Valley. It's the lowest point, and it is key to our agricultural survival down here. With the Colorado River, every acre foot of water that comes in brings a ton of salt, and you have to remove that salt from the soils in order for the crops to remain productive and not have the land salt up so you can't farm. As a result of that, there's leaching water and runoff from the fields that collects and ends up in the Salton Sea. So historically, about a third of the water coming into the valley ends up draining out to the Salton Sea. But as a result of massive agriculture to urban transfers that were necessary in the early 2000s in order for the state of California to limit its water use, IID was forced into this unenviable position of implementing these transfers in order for that water to be made available to San Diego and Los Angeles and the Coachella area so their community could thrive. The challenge for us is the consequential effects of those transfers. So when you conserve water, you reduce the amount of water that runs off into the Salton Sea, and that body of water has started to shrink. So for the first 15 years, we sent mitigation water to the sea. We had an environmental mitigation requirement that we keep the salinity of the sea somewhat steady for that 15-year period while the state of California figured out how to implement a restoration obligation that they legislatively agreed to in order to convince IID to enter into these transfers. Our board was not a fan of transfers, and they were very concerned about a community that relies on farming being asked to do less farming, and in particular fallowing, which is basically paying growers not to farm. In order to avoid that, we did enter into a water conservation transfer, but it was predicated on using less water but still farming the same and implementing these efficiency conservation measures, not just fallowing. So after the 15 years of the fallowing that was required was over, we've now converted, and all of our conservation activities are promoting more farming, just using less water and being more efficient. So we have a very large farmer program where we incentivize them to implement conservation measures like land leveling, drip irrigation, sprinkler irrigation. The goal is not to farm less, but to farm more using less water. But the consequence is less drainage to the Salton Sea and a shrinking Salton Sea. So we've already seen about probably close to about 30,000 acres of shoreline exposure based on that declining elevation. And it's not all transfer related. Some of it's related to drought and just general climate change conditions that we see everywhere with reduced water supplies. However, we now need to make sure that we implement actions to try to eliminate or at least minimize the public health issues associated with that rejection in shoreline. And the state of California similarly has a restoration responsibility, which is a larger responsibility than IID's mitigation responsibility. But we're trying to coordinate our activities and identify those areas of the shore that have the most potential to blow dust, and then implement practices and conservation measures that reduce the dust on them in order to help preserve the public health. Similarly, the state's tasked with some habitat requirements and trying to ensure that some of those projects, about 50% of them, achieve some level of environmental benefit to offset the declining habitat at the Salton Sea.
Right. So what is the QSA for the people who have no idea what that is?
So the QSA stands for the Quantification Settlement Agreement, and it was a series of probably over 40 legal agreements that the goal of which was to reduce California's water use. Historically speaking, we have a limit of 4.4 million acre feet, but the urban areas, particularly Los Angeles, was drawing more off the river than what the entitlement was for. They're allowed to do that. The rules allow you to use other states' apportionments that aren't used, but the state of Arizona decided that they wanted to maximize their use of their supply, and they implemented a groundwater storage program in the late 1990s. That then caused them to use their full entitlement, which meant there was less water available for California. The challenge was that extra water had been being used by LA and the urban areas, who now saw a shortage in their supply. And the only means by which the political powers that be thought to solve that problem is to look at how to keep the pipeline full to Los Angeles. But with IID having 70% of rights to Colorado River waters within California, we sort of became the solution to their problem. So there was a lot of pressure for our community to give up water, which of course, why would we do that and sacrifice our community for an urban area? But the compromise, and I say compromise with a little bit of hesitation, because our board at least twice and more formally voted down the QSA and said we don't like the terms, we think it's going to hurt our community. And then we were the subject to legal action by the federal government where they tried to reduce our water and take it from us. So ultimately the concerns had always been about the Salton Sea and what would happen as that shoreline receded and the community effects we would face just to try to prop up these urban areas. But the state of California passed legislation that required them to take on that restoration responsibility. That was an acknowledgement that for California as a whole, it was important to do this ag to urban transfer, but in exchange, they would step up and they would take over those consequential effects at the Salton Sea and implement projects.
This is the state would step up and
yes, the state had that restoration responsibility. We as a water district had certain mitigation responsibilities, but the Salton Sea issue is much larger. It isn't just a receding shoreline, it's the fact that that water going in is drainage water and it's very salty, and with evaporation due to us living in the desert and a smaller supply, it's just going to get saltier and saltier.
Is the QSA limited? Is there a point in time where it expires or you can renegotiate? Do you know?
So it has an initial 45-year term.
Oh,
There
wow.
is a renewal option for another 35 years. So it could be very extensive if those renewals are triggered. But we know now that it's going to go at least 45 years, and that is approximately 300,000 acre feet of water that we have to conserve. But that's just one transfer. We already had transfers in place with the Metropolitan Water District, and these are all arising from litigation in the 1980s related to IID's water use. So we sort of had an obligation to get more efficient, but there's consequences to that. So the state of California said, hey, this is a big deal. We're going to take on that burden and we're going to share it with you, IID. You need to implement these conservation programs and make that water available, but we're going to step in and we're going to help your community out. We held them to that, and unfortunately they didn't do anything. For 15 years we sent mitigation water to the sea, and it really should have been a planning period for the state of California. And it became pretty apparent about 10 years in that the state of California was kicking the can. You know, they didn't have a problem now, yeah, they had a responsibility, but the shoreline wasn't shrinking. And in the middle of the drought a couple of years ago, IID said, you know what, we've had enough. We see what's going on here. We see that the state of California, while they signed the contract, they haven't done anything. And we threw a little bit of a hissy fit and said, you know what, you're not going to affect our community and not do what you promised to do when we're doing what we promised to do. We're sending water every year to these urban areas, and you need to step up. So we filed a petition with the state board and said, essentially, the state of California is not doing what it's obligated to do, and we're going to turn everything off. This is a legal breach of a contract. It's not what our community was promised, and we're not going to continue to send you that water if you're not going to live up to your restoration obligation.
When was the petition?
The petition was resolved in 2017. I think it was filed
Okay.
in 2014 or 2015, and we spent 2 to 3 years working with the various state representatives and local advocacy agencies such as the Salton Sea Authority and Imperial County, as well as the NGOs that were representing the environment. You promised, and now it's time to pay the piper and step up to your obligation.
Why do you think the state has not been, I know this Salton Sea Management Program started in 2017, you haven't really seen any progress. Why do you think the state has been so lagging?
I think the Salton Sea is a tremendously difficult solution to solve the
Fair,
problem. And it's in kind of the middle of nowhere. We're here in Southern California. We don't have a large population, which means we don't have a lot of political advocacy. And you know, California has a lot of problems going on. And I think it was an acknowledgement, or maybe a non-acknowledgement, that it was a really big problem and it's an expensive problem. And I just think there wasn't an interest politically because we didn't have the votes and we didn't have the population. There's not a lot of political representation from this area. We're a border community. We're very disadvantaged from an economic standpoint, and the community isn't good at raising its voices. And when we did band together in 2014 and 2015 and go to the state board and say, we're going to turn that water off, it may not have made a difference in a normal year, but when California was in the middle of a 3-year drought and they had no idea where their water was going to come from, and we were threatening to turn off a significant supply that they had come to rely on, it made a difference. And to the Brown administration's credit, they stepped up and stopped denying they had a problem and sort of acknowledged it. But then the challenge was you hadn't done anything for 10 years, and it takes time. All of the time that should have been spent planning and permitting was wasted, and that's the struggle we see now. I see a big change in the state of California. I see actions occurring that most people won't see because it's not on the ground and physical, but as far as starting to throw staffing efforts at it, working on environmental compliance, designing projects, they are really in it, but it's still early stages, and it would have been nice to have had that 10 years behind us and be on the ground moving dirt now instead of designing projects to move dirt.
We've lost like a decade, more
Exactly.
than a decade. Are you talking about the California Natural Resources Agency, more
Yes.
staffing? Okay.
Yes.
Is it accurate to say after the QSA, so you guys had expected the state to kind of step up and help with these restoration projects, and there was just nothing done from like 2003 to like 2017 when the management program, okay.
Yeah.
We were digging through our files, and our morning anchor, Jeff Stahl, had done a story at the Red Hill Bay Marina talking about that project and the groundbreaking. And on camera, he had said it's slated to be done in 2016. Obviously, that has not happened. What happened there?
Well, there's a lot of complexities, and I'm going to be limited on what I can talk about because we're in the middle of a regulatory compliance a decision-making process with Imperial County, but it was a multi-agency jurisdictional effort, and I think that makes it complicated. You had funding by the state of California. It was the federal agency doing the implementing. They had come to IID and asked, could you help us out on some of the permitting and some of the contracting issues that your agency can do faster than us? And it's been very complicated. I think the main problem with that project is because you had so many different bureaucratic agencies working on it, and because it's very complicated, when they would come up with a design and then look at the funding they had, it was insufficient. So they would go back and redo the design and get more funding, and then you would come back again and you'd go out and get a bid for cost estimates, and the estimates were higher than the budget. So it's been this back and forth process of designing, redesigning, getting more funding, going back to the table. And now the consequence is we're in a regulatory action as to responsibility as a landowner for IID of the air quality issues associated with that project. But you have additional complications related to lease issues on that property that have been in place for over 50 years.
I'm gonna stop here quick. There is a little insect in your hair. I just wanna, make sure it's out of there. Okay. Let's go back. You were saying, I think, are you referring to the notice of violation? I saw that from
Yes.
Imperial County Air Pollution
Yes.
District. Let's go from there. Why did they issue that?
I think that's a question you should ask them.
Okay.
My guess is they were trying to push the project forward in a little regulatory manner, but it's very much complicated the project. I think it's caused additional delays to the project, and it's created local tensions between agencies that really should be working together to move projects forward. That would be the ideal situation. But IID will, as a landowner, step up. We're very concerned about the public health. We have a project in mind that we have designed, and actually I think the tractor work should start next week to do a project that involves creating furrows like a farmer would create in his field, and then we will be seeding that project with native vegetation and irrigating in the fall when it's more ideal planting conditions. We think the vegetation furrowing alone will reduce the dust by 80 to 90%, if not more. We've seen very effective projects that we've done in other areas here, and we're going to be taking the most expedient path forward to resolve that issue outside of this regulatory tension and legal process that's embarked. There's a challenge with the Red Hill Bay project too. What we're doing would not preclude that project from being developed in the future, but that project was essentially developed prior to the elevation dropping at the Salton Sea. And the current design will no longer work because the intake for the water supply to that project is now above the elevation of the river. So not only have the permits expired on the existing project, but there's going to be a weir that needs to be installed in the river, and that has a ton of permitting involved with it, and it's now a much more technically complicated and probably expensive project to move forward. So we will be taking these near-term actions, and should Fish and Wildlife Service be able to resolve some of the outstanding issues they have, and we can address all of those other nuances, then that project could then follow what we're doing to address the public health issue.
That makes sense. If the water's level dropped, obviously you can't take the water in. I had seen, it was like a quick shot of the plan in 2015 of, what was dry there would have brought the water in and would have pumped through. Why wasn't it done in that time frame though, because the water would have been feasible at that point if it had
so
been
there were
done
a
in
lot of
2015.
funding issues. We went out to bid a couple times to assist the Fish and Wildlife Service on contracting, and the bids came back higher than the amount of money budgeted for those projects. And so we as an agency can't move forward and award bids when there is insufficient funding to cause that. So that was one of the complications. The other complication has to do with the habitat aspects of the project. You need to blend Salton Sea water with the river water because there's a concern about the bioaccumulation of spring water and the impacts that could have on habitat that choose to use that water source. And the problem is the Salton Sea is receding. So there was a very interesting concept of a barge that you would put a pump on, and as the sea receded, the barge would recede too. But obviously that's, from a technical standpoint, a pretty bold idea. And I think it had a lot of challenges with it that weren't as well thought out as they could have been at the time. Nor do I think people really thought 5 to 10 years ahead about how far that shoreline would recede and how you would handle that floating barge and the extension of the power service necessary and the water line and whatnot. So there are going to have to be some redesign aspects of that project.
So is that the typical process? The state awards money, you come up with the plan. There was a groundbreaking, but then you look for bids afterward.
Well, I think it depends. I mean, the complication on this project is it was a federal agency implementing a project they had designed. IID, as a local agency, was assisting them on some of the permitting and contracting that they may not have had the staff here at a local level to do, and the money was coming from a state agency. So IID, as a special district, does not have any authority to contract for services without having the funding source lined up. And since we were doing this on behalf of Fish and Wildlife Service, we couldn't just go and award a bid without having that contracting mechanism in place. So there's a lot of nuances that are sort of hard to explain, but when you are a recipient of grant funding from the state, there's a lot of restrictions on how you can do things and the processes you have to use in order to implement those projects. And there's a lot of other nuances going on, but I don't really want to get into those right now because of the regulatory process that's ongoing.
We talked to the Natural Resources Agency, someone from there a while ago, and doing all the research into the Salton Sea, it sounds like there's just too many cooks in the kitchen. There's like a million agencies trying to do, and everyone has different visions. California Natural Resources Agency made it sound like they have no ownership down here. Therefore, what they want to do is really difficult because they don't have any rights. And so when you have to get competing landowners to agree on a thing, that's why progress has not been as efficient as they would like, is what they said. I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think it's a convenient excuse. So there's two very large landowners at the Salton Sea. The largest is the federal government, whether it's BLM or Bureau of Reclamation, and the second largest is the Imperial Irrigation District. Certainly, if you own a project, you have a lot more flexibility to go do things whenever you want. We have worked with the state of California to develop an easement for their 4,000 plus or minus acre species conservation habitat project, but it took a long time to get that done, and it actually took Governor Newsom's administration stepping in and realizing that they had obligations and committing to some flexibility. We had challenges when we were contracting through a legal document like an easement with the state of California, because they kept trying to use their template documents, which puts all of the liability and responsibility on IID. And we said, wait a minute, you legislatively agreed to restoration at the Salton Sea. We can't give you an easement where you're going to do whatever you want and we're ultimately liable. You already got that liability when you passed that legislation back in, the early 2000s. You can't contract it away. That would just be crazy. We have limited liability due to all of the existing QSA documents and agreements. So Governor Newsom's administration brought in some of their higher ranking officials that were able to sort of make changes to those government template documents. And we did resolve, we weren't completely happy with it and neither were they. So I think that's a good agreement when people are sort of mutually unsatisfied. And we resolved the liability issues as best we could to allow that project to move forward. I do think that that's a challenge moving forward. We've seen some new draft documents from the state on other parcels that were kind of back to that original square, and I kind of think it might be related to these regulatory actions the local agencies have taken on liability. The state of California has been issued an NOV as well on one of their projects, and I think it makes them a little nervous about moving forward that level of responsibility they're accepting. But we've resolved these issues in the past, and I think if we sit down and roll up our sleeves, the IID in the state of California will continue to work. We're working very closely with them on the SCH design in order to ensure that their new project coordinates well with our drainage system, because they're going to be connecting, and we'll resolve these easements because we always do. It would be a lot easier, I think, if we didn't have sort of legal actions and regulatory issues swirling on the side, but I understand the county's wanting to protect public health, and as a landowner and as residents down here, we all want to do the same thing. So we're hoping the state of California steps up on that project. We're hoping they locate some of their staff down here. I think that's been a big frustration for us, is dealing with everybody out of Sacramento that aren't familiar with the local site conditions, that don't have relationships with the existing farmers and adjacent landowners, because some of our best advice is from our local folks telling us, why are you doing that? That's crazy. Here's what I do on my farm, and here's a way you can do this more effectively and cheaper. And we've learned a lot, and lots of times the criticism's hard to hear, but the local landowners and agriculturists have an expertise that's unparalleled, and we've learned at Imperial Irrigation District to take advantage of that, and we hope the state of California gets some of their staff down here so that they understand the rain events and the soil conditions and how you operate in these soils without getting stuck and whatnot.
Right. Is wetland habitats, restoration on that front for the environment, is that a priority for IID?
So we care very much about the restoration aspect. It's a little outside of our job description as a water and power agency. And there's lots of complications with managements that we're ill-suited to. So we think that those are tasks that are best performed by the California Natural Resources Agency, because they have the whole fish and wildlife organizations, that they have their expertise and experience that they can rely on. So we're trying to partner with them on these projects and make lands available for that. Similarly, we have some interest in partnering with some NGOs as well. Our board will be hearing a presentation on Tuesday from the Audubon Society, who's proposing a wetlands project on an area in Bombay Beach that IID is a part owner, and as is the federal government. And we're hoping that our board will give us some direction to move forward on developing some lease agreements or sales of property transactions or easements to allow that project to move forward. So I think we're very interested in the environmental aspects. It's just a little outside of our day-to-day business, and we prefer to work with other entities on those.
Right. If Audubon brought it to you, then it'd possibly be on the horizon and to be a partner with them.
Exactly.
In bringing this. Gotcha.
Exactly. And we would defer to them on those biological aspects because that's their expertise.
Right. I don't know if you've seen that documentary, Miracle in the Desert. Toward the end, it kind of paints IID as the bad guy a lot, for some of them said putting profits over people. And it accuses implicitly IID of not doing more to bring water to the Salton Sea. Any response to that, saying that IID hasn't done all it could have?
Well, I haven't seen the documentary, but IID is a nonprofit agency. We're a public utility. We don't make money. That's not our business. We have a large target on our back everywhere because we have a significant right to Colorado River water. And frankly, the Colorado River exists today because of the farming in this community and the water that results from those activities. So I don't know exactly what claims were made, but the reason there's water in Imperial Valley is because of IID.
Right. I mean, since the early 1900s
Right.
to bring it here. Tell me about some of the projects that you guys have worked on besides Red Hill Bay. Are there other projects you guys are currently working on, looking into? There's one at the Bombay Beach. I kind of want to get an idea of all the different projects going on.
So we've got about 2,000 acres of dust suppression projects that we've implemented on a pilot basis. We've spent a lot of time doing surveys around the Salton Sea. It's very important to us to have a technical science-based program. And so what we do is we work with our outside consultants who have an expertise in soils and dust control measures and have worked up at Owens Lake. And we identify what specific soil types and wind conditions are on sites and where the areas are that have the most dust emissions potential.
Sorry, hold on. Let me just come on. Yeah, come on through so we're not in our shots. Do you know Carrie? Carrie's our next interview. Carrie, Tina, Carrie.
Hi. Let me just take a minute. You mentioned SCH. Maybe you want to clarify what SCH means.
What does that see?
SCH is Species Conservation Habitat. That's the
Okay.
state's cornerstone project
Yeah.
that they're working on
So
right now.
let's go to that. So you're talking about the projects that IAD.
Yeah, so we've
working
implemented
on.
about 2,000 acres of demonstration projects for dust control. We're also working with the state of California on helping to facilitate their projects. So we had a lot of projects that, while we implemented 2,000 acres, we've got about 7,000 acres identified in the planning process, which goes through an initial identification of the soils and the wind conditions and what would be the appropriate measure. Then we have to look at environmental permitting and what other clearances we need in order to move that project forward. We have to set up a monitoring network so that we can ensure we collect the data, because we want to make sure that the projects are effective, and if they're not effective, we want to make changes to those projects so that they are effective. So it is a process to get projects built. Now that the state's coming on board, we've been working with them. They've asked us to help them facilitate projects. So some of these projects we're transitioning over to their control to implement. We're trying to teach them how we design these projects and coordinate our efforts, because what we don't want to do is duplicate efforts. We also want to make sure that they use our experience and they decide the right project goes on the right soil type, because the worst thing you could do, for instance, is go to a piece of sandy soil and do furrowing, and really you're creating a dust problem.
Right.
It isn't effective there. But on different soil types with more clay, that furrowing is extremely effective. And we want to make sure that the state isn't just checking boxes on committing acreage in order to meet their milestones. We want them to get the most effective quality projects. Our dust surveys have shown us that 80% of the emissions are occurring on only 20% of the land. So from our perspective, even if the state has acreage milestones on an annual basis, which they're not meeting, well, if you're not going to meet them, then go pick the acres that have the most potential for dust to come and put your projects there. Because I'd much rather have half the acreage done with twice the effectiveness than have them go put a project down on an area that doesn't even need it so that they can check that acreage box. And so we're working very closely with them. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there is this time period it takes from a planning to a site identification to a permitting to actual on the ground tractor moving. And that's the queue process that we're in. So I think you'll really start to see the projects picking up probably towards the end of this year when their SCH construction starts. And then we should have more projects rolling out moving forward after that.
What is the typical time frame from idea conception to actually breaking ground, you think?
So it depends on where the project's located and the soil type. The projects on the southern side are complicated by the connectivity to IAD's irrigation and drainage system, because we have to ensure that the water continues to flow off the fields and doesn't back up by the construction of these projects. The challenging areas and the areas that have the most dust potential are on the areas that don't have a water supply. And if you don't have a water supply, it's very challenging to find a project that will keep that dust down. You can put hay bales out, you can put up sand fences, but really one of the most effective measures is to get native vegetation out there growing and sort of disturb those wind cycles, which means you need a water source. So we're currently looking at doing some test groundwater wells to develop a water supply. It doesn't have to be pristine water. It can even be a little bit saline, because the species that we see out here are very tolerant of salts. and they're more desert type of brushes and shrubs. So if we can find some saline groundwater to irrigate some native vegetation and get those plants established, their roots eventually grow down and tap into that groundwater, and that's the most effective means. Those projects can take a lot longer because you need to identify where the groundwater comes from, you need to see how accessible it is, you may have to get power out to that site. So those can take a lot longer than area that perhaps was farmed 40 or 50 years ago and then was underwater. I mean, the challenge at the Salton Sea 20 years ago was flooding. When I joined the district in the late 1990s, we were building dikes around the sea to prevent the farmland from being flooding, and now we have the opposite challenge, which is the shoreline's receding. And we have these vast open spaces that if you look at the historical maps, they used to be farm ground.
Right. The bureaucracy from, like I said, inception to implementing, I mean, is it accurate to say, I mean, that typically doesn't happen within like a 1 year time frame, or does it? I don't know what the paperwork is like.
You know, if it's a really simple project that's just furrowing and it's on property you own, you could probably do it in a year.
Okay.
A lot of it depends on water sources that can trigger an Army Corps permit, depending on the type of construction you're doing. Is it in an existing canal system, or are you extending a canal into an area? And in that area, if is desert or has some flooding occurred that's created some habitat. The minute you have habitat on a project site, even if it's through accidental flooding, you now need different permits, and you may have to mitigate that area. So even though you're addressing the dust, if you have an effect on that naturally occurring habitat, you then have to do a mitigation project somewhere else. So it's a little, you know, that part's a little tough to handle when you're mitigating the mitigation, and it makes it a challenge. It'd be nice if somebody just said, hey, as long as what you do out there is better than what's there now, you're good to go. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way.
Right. Tell me about IID's long-term plan. We have, you know, projects here and there trying to mitigate the dust, but this is a massive problem that the shoreline's going to keep receding. It's going to keep getting more saline, more toxic. Is there a long-term plan 20, 30 years down the line? We've heard different ideas. The canal being built from Sea of Cortez all the way to Salton Sea. Is there anything you guys have in mind?
So the long-term plan is the responsibility of the state of California. The challenge with the Salton Sea historically has been it's a really big problem, which means it's really expensive. And how do you take on that effort? And anytime the groups historically have come together, you end up with a plan that just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and it's a Christmas tree with too many ornaments, and then it never happens. So IID's focus when we filed the petition with the state board was smaller but sustainable. Let's get something started. Things are happening, you can't undo time, and we're already behind. So the state of California committed to that 10-year plan, and from our perspective, well, it's not the end of their obligation, it's a start. And we've seen 75 years of not starting. So the most important thing for us was to get started. Once you're started, you're sort of all in at that point, and what you need to do is grow your program. The state of California has some obligations for long-term planning. You know, we think that the water import are a little distracting because those are very complicated projects. They're extremely expensive. The permitting is even more draconian because now you have another country you're having to deal with. And IID has a lot of experience dealing with Mexico on other binational water issues, and they're very complicated projects and they're very political projects, and they have their own issues where the water supply comes from in the Sea of Cortez. There's some natural habitats down there. So while we don't necessarily think it should be off the table, if we spend too much effort focusing on that, we're going to lose this near-term momentum that we've gained, and we want to build on that. And we also think we need to be realistic. All of the data and the climate and hydrology information on the Colorado River and all water supplies talk about these longer-term droughts. They talk about limited supplies in the future. They talk about 50% reductions due to climate change alone. And essentially what we're doing now is mitigating a water transfer. And it's very difficult to mitigate a water transfer with water. They sort of cross each other out. If that were the case, we just won't do the transfer and we'll go back to farming the way we always farm, and the sea will fill back up to where it was. But that was not what the federal government wanted, and that is not what the state of California would allow IID to do. We were told, you will enter into this water transfer or we will cut your order and take that water from you. And the district leadership at the time decided that it was better to have a financial partner in the state of California in the restoration of the sea, and agree to do these efficiency-based water conservations where we could still have a community that was largely based on agriculture than to have a government action that came in and took that water with no responsibility for the Salton Sea and no commitment to helping our community out. So it really wasn't a voluntary transfer. I know people
So,
like to say that. And
voluntold.
yeah, our board voted for it, but it was only after significant federal actions and court decisions. And it was one of those things, you know, when you fight the federal government, I mean, how long can you win? We went on a couple technicalities, but eventually they're going to get your way, because otherwise you're talking about reducing water supplies to Los Angeles. I mean, that's not going to go over very well.
Right. So do you see this more as like a federal and state issue where they told you to do this thing and that they would be responsible for the restoration and would be there to help us with the dust mitigation, and then they kind of just dropped the ball?
They completely dropped the ball. The state of California was supposed to be a partner, and it was based on a federal action. I think the challenge we have now is the state didn't do what it needed to do, but to their credit, they're trying to catch up. Now who seems to be missing is the federal government, and they like to defer and say it's the state's responsibility. And we said, well, that's really nice, and yeah, that's what we agreed to in 2003, but you're the largest landowner at the Salton Sea. And you keep coming back to IID as one of the largest Colorado River water users and saying, can't you help a friend out? There's a drought. Lake Mead's elevation is dropping. You have more potential to do conservation because you have more water uses. Well, that's great, but we did that in 2003 based on promises you made, and nobody kept their promises. So when they came back with the drought contingency plan, it said, well, don't worry about the sea, we'll take care of that later. We said, no, you take care of the sea now, then we'll help you out on your drought contingency plans. And as we move forward in the new renegotiations on the Colorado River, the current operating guidelines expire in 2025. IID's been very vocal about saying you can't ignore the Salton Sea anymore. Last time you promised and we took you up on that, and you have not delivered. So this time you're going to take care of the Salton Sea first. Then we'll talk about the things IID can do to help out the river community in the 7 basin states. But you're not going to leave us holding the bag like you did last time.
Are you hopeful they'll come through this time?
I think you have to be hopeful, because otherwise it's kind of a depressing future. I am heartened by the actions I see occurring, and I'm in a unique position because most people can't see what I see because there's nothing going on at the sea. You know, there's not tractors out there, although, you know, there are some construction companies starting work. But I work very closely with a lot of IID staff and the state's natural agency representatives that comprise their Salton Sea office. So we are working with them as they develop their SCH plan. We're helping them on the design aspect. We're giving them, I'm sure they think it's criticism. We're trying to be constructive and help them design a good project. We have a lot of experience in canals and drains down here, so we know what works and we know what doesn't work. And we've been helping them through their redesign to make sure that that species conservation habitat project is a premier project, that it doesn't fail when we have a crazy storm event down here, that it doesn't back the water up and flood out our farmers, and that it's an effective project that they can then build on. So, I mean, it's a team effort, but you can't see the things they're doing because at the Salton Sea, still nothing's happening. I think that they sent to the state an acknowledgement that they had committed about 755 acres of new projects in 2020. Well, that's nice, but they were supposed to do 3,500 acres by then. So, you know, they're starting to catch up, but, you know, it's going to take time. I don't know when they'll actually meet their target. But from IID's perspective, as long as they grow that program on an annual basis, as long as they continue to take the actions necessary where we can see that they're in it and they're not running away from it, and that to me is the biggest change. They spent nearly 15 years running away from the problem and pretending like we didn't exist, and now they've acknowledged they have a problem and they're starting to take those actions. It'd be nice if they'd throw a little more money and resources at it. We understand there's a lot of challenges right now in the state, and we're hoping that when they have some success with their first project, we then build off that and expand the program.
Do you have any final words or a conclusion about everything that's going on here for everyone, the people who are hopeful to the people who have given IID flack, saying they're not doing enough, to just the overall scheme, the future of what Salton Sea is going to look like if we stay on the path we are on?
Well, I think it's a different Salton Sea, and I'm not a fan of the word restoration because the Salton Sea isn't going to be what it was. You know, we see the pictures in the 1960s and the heyday. I mean, that's not going to be the Salton Sea in the future. But I think there can be some beautiful habitat out there. I think there can be some unique features that the community benefits from, but it's going to be different than what it was in the past because you have water that's going to be a lot more saline and you have a lot less water. And I think what we have to do is sort of make lemonade of the situation. We have to see what the realities of the on-the-ground topography are and the water supply, and we have to design a project that's going to be successful and not sort of over glorify what the situation might be and design projects that will fail in the future. And I'm hopeful that that will happen. IAD's been a part of this community for over 110 years, and we intend to be here for another 110 years. And it is our goal to implement expedient projects within our resources, but we also intend to hold people accountable. And I don't know that IAD gets enough credit for getting the state of California back down here. Had we not filed that petition and spent all of those efforts on the legal front, holding them accountable, including threatening to turn the water off, and we would have done it. I mean, we're a little extreme out here because that's what it takes to get people's attention. We've also spent a lot of time connecting the Salton Sea to the Colorado River. Folks in Utah don't like to see that connection, but it's very real to us because we live here. And I think there's a better understanding now that when you implement these transfers, there are consequential effects. And I honestly don't think that we're going to see these massive transfers in the future. I think that what you see now in urban areas is a focus on recycled water programs and reuse and making the best and maximizing the supplies they have because there are these consequential effects. And it's just unreal that our community has the downside, but those communities keep building subdivisions and swimming pools.
Right.
And I don't think that that's going to be the wave of the future.
You guys have any questions? Nothing I've asked? Nothing? All right, very good. Hi, Carrie. Thanks for being here. You're next. Anything you want to ask Tina?
Anything I want to ask Tina? I guess just
Why not?
one thing does come to mind. We're excited for SCH. A lot of people are really excited for that. I level with you very much in where the state has not done what they should do. I stood with IID for the petition at the state water board near you. But I'm wondering how we can quickly step up and get some wetlands done that need to be built. What would IID need to finish the Red Hill Bay wetland project? You know, what would the Fish and Wildlife Service need to do? What would the state need to do to allow IID to be a great partner in doing their part to build this project?
I think we're challenged right now because it's a regulatory process, and frankly, Fish and Wildlife Service has opted out of that. So until we get through this regulatory process, we can't enter into an agreement with the county to solve a regulatory problem that relies on another agency's actions. And
So what
the
does
Fish and
IID
Wildlife Service has declined to be a part of this current NOV process. So I can't go much farther than that, but what we can do now is what we have the authority to do, and we will be starting on that next week. We would have had some more work done this week on the initial steps to address the public health issue, except the winds picked up, and so we obviously didn't want to cause more dust. But we're going to do what's expedient to address the public health first. To the extent that when that project's implemented and we've addressed the public health issue, there are opportunities to come back and backfill with a restoration project that's more wetlands oriented. You're going to have to get new permits on the project. The current permits are all expired. We need to get a WEIR, and we will be working on that longer term because that area needs water regardless. But we also have to keep in mind what the adjacent projects are, what the adjacent landowners are. There's existing site leases that have to be resolved. So there's a lot of complexities that frankly should have been addressed much earlier in the project, and for whatever reason they weren't. And so we will have to move forward as best we can after the public health issue is addressed.
So the state, when you say opted out, they just went no contact, or they're just not responding?
Fish
Is
and Wildlife
that-
Service has declined to be a part of the NOV process
They
that
can
we're
just
currently
do
in.
that? I didn't.
I don't want to speak on their behalf. but
Sure,
the
right. I thought you'd
discussions-
like-
Yeah,
right.
the discussions we've had with the county, other than the very first meeting, the Fish and Wildlife Service has not been a part of. So,
Okay.
and their solicitor sent a letter saying they had no responsibility. So,
But they do.
you'll have to take that up with
Okay,
them.
right. I mean, I'm talking to them next week, so we'll see.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting that they can just say we have no responsibility when they're a partner on this. Right?
Well, and frankly, they're the ones that had the dozers out there moving the dirt in the first place. IOD has not had any construction activities or staff involved in that. So we've helped with contracting and, you know, project design and permitting, but
Does the money stay with them since the money is state money? Is that how it works, or do they give some to you to buy materials? How does that?
well, I
work?
can't tell you the details of the grant. I don't have them in front of me, but
Okay.
there's a state grant. I think it's in the Fish and Wildlife's hands now. At one point, some of those monies were sort of subordinated to IID, but it's a complicated process.
Okay.
And you're subject to normal grant terms, right? And all
Right,
of
now
that.
there's a lot of
But the
restrictions.
grant's back in the Fish and Wildlife's hands, and you know, hopefully that will allow them to move a little quicker on the project without having to have too many agencies involved.
Okay.
Is it true that the Fish and Wildlife Service would have the funds to do their part of the wetland project if Fish and Wildlife and IID come to an agreement on easement and land access? So
I
understand
can't.
that the projects, I mean, that the land is owned by IID. If an agreement comes to between these two agencies, is that what will trigger Fish and Wildlife Service to get the money from the state to finish the project?
I couldn't speak to the grant details at this point in time. There is an outstanding lease issue. I will tell you that we have sent the Fish and Wildlife Service a lease. It obviously was not to their satisfaction. There's existing tenants that have been on that property that predate the Fish and Wildlife Service. So those are more complicated real estate and legal issues that have to be addressed. Frankly, even with that grant money, because there's now a weir needed in the river to elevate, there's probably a financial shortfall. That's been one of the ongoing problems with this is when you get a bid on a project, you don't have enough money, you secure more money and you go out and now the cost have increased because time has passed and it's sort of a little bit of a rock and a hard place for that project. But I'm confident that we will work through whatever issues there are. If Fish and Wildlife Service has a long-term interest in this and we resolve those issues and they're open to, you know, negotiating out an agreement that works for both sides, then I'm sure they can come back and make that work. So we'll have to see. It may be too moving forward that as the shoreline recedes, there are better areas for that type of a project as well. I think that, you know, when we design these projects, we need to be looking ahead as to what that area is going to look like 2 years later and 4 years later and 10 years later, because it may be that projects need to be sited a little farther in as well to avoid that area. Because, I mean, when you look at the projections over the long term, you have a shoreline that could go 4 miles in some places.
Right.
So you could have a stranded body of water here and it may need to be someplace else. So
Right.
those are things that will have to be looked at in the design process.
Okay. Okay. Is there anything else I missed that you want to bring up and mention?
Nope, I
Make
think
sure
we're
we've been
good.
there. Okay. I love this comparison of ancient Lake Kawia to the current Salton Sea shoreline. Go ahead and tell me about it.
I don't know a lot of the history, but so
Well, you can throw in what you do know. 30,000
So you
acres
can
has
see
been
from this
exposed.
graphic that the shoreline of the ancient Lake Kawia, which is the precursor to the Salton Sea, was about 3 times the size of the current sea. And even now that blue area, the shoreline has receded so that there's close to 30,000 acres that are exposed that used to be underwater since 2003. So the sea over time and even prehistoric time has increased and decreased pretty significantly based on flooding and storm events, and now more importantly urban and agricultural water uses in the areas. The sea benefits from flows from the Imperial Valley as well as the Coachella Valley, and there's actually probably about 75,000 acre feet a year that comes from Mexico through the New River. So you add those all together, and while Imperial Valley agriculture is the largest contributor, there are other significant sources, and then you have occasional storm events. We don't get a lot of storms in this area, but we do tend to get more monsoonal storms, so it can be a couple percentages of the actual inflow on an annual basis depending on the circumstances. What you also will see as the sea recedes is most of the exposure will be in the south end. Most of the
Yeah.
acreage will be in the south end because the topography is much shallower. So 1 foot of elevation drop could expose 10,000 acres, where on the north end, 1 foot of elevation drop might only be 100 acres.
Right.
So it's the deeper portion of the Salton Sea is at the north end. The area to the west is also adjacent to a desert area. So you have sand dunes creeping at about 50 meters a year going east. So you have a new challenge because now it's covered by water if you have areas exposed and you have sand dunes and you have wind, it's a sort of a recipe for disaster
Yeah.
because it creates sort of a sandpaper effect. And on a normal day, like today, you might have no blowing dust, but if you get a sandstorm going, you have just complete chaos out there. And there's no water supplies on the west side and the east side. So you have challenges if you're trying to implement projects that rely on vegetation to control the dust.
Where's the new river coming from? How does it course?
So the New River is coming from over here, from
Okay.
Mexico,
I
and
see.
the Alamo River comes here, but that is blocked up at the border, so there's no water coming from Mexico. So that's largely
okay.
agriculture from Imperial Valley, and then any rain and storm events from this side. I think the Chocolate Mountains over here that contribute as well. We also know based on our technical studies that at this point in time, if you look at the emissions inventory of the dust around the Salton Sea, only about 1% of the dust is coming from the north end. So we know we hear that there's disparities in where the projects are being constructed, but it's because mitigation addresses a problem. And right now, 99% of the problem is not at the north end of the sea. It's largely in the southern areas because that's where most of the acreage is exposed. And the soil types are different up here. And so we don't see the emissions that we do from these other areas. So we have a lot of cameras set up
Yeah.
that when we have wind events, we have cameras in 6 or 7 different locations, including one at the top of Red Hill, and it rotates and takes a picture about every 10 minutes. And during storm events, we look for the dust plumes, and then we can go out and track and trace those pieces of property where the dust is coming from, and that helps us identify where we need to put projects in the future.
Do you have video of that we could use to show how you come to that decision or just
So,
how bad it
yeah,
can
if
be?
you go on our website, you can actually access the cameras there, and they have archival data, so you can go back in time and see those.
Okay. I'll email you just so we have like written permission to go on and take it without
Yeah,
your
yeah,
permission to use. Accurate to say that perhaps the exposed playa is worse at the southern end. I mean, that's where we see like the
Yeah,
Imperial
you're going
Valley
to see
children.
a lot more acreage on the southern end. Also, the populations, the winds tend to blow this direction.
South, yeah.
So the wind events tend to happen here. There are some smaller communities on this side. That's a challenging area because, again, it's very sandy without water sources. But you don't often have the dust winds going in that direction. But it does happen on occasion.
Yeah.
So,
We were
and certainly
tracking.
because the communities are so close, the state's really focusing on those areas, trying to say, are there any emissive lands? We've not been able to identify that many so far, but certainly there's isolated events, and it's going to be hard to get an area where there's no dust occurring. But what you're looking for is over time, where are historically the largest concentrations of those dust?
Yeah, and it's at the southern area, it looks like.
And that's where the acreage is being exposed. So the
Right.
sea's dropped, I think, about 9 feet in the last close to 20 years, 9.5 feet.
Wow.
So it's been pretty significant. A lot of that elevation decline occurred when IOD was sending mitigation water. So that would lead you to say that a good chunk of that elevation drop may be associated with other non-transfer related events, whether it was urban water recycling, urban water conservation activities,
Were you sending the same amount of mitigation water as prior to the QSA, that same equal?
It was a calculation done based on the amount of water transferred, and it was equivalent volume. So if we transferred 100 acre feet to San Diego, we sent 100 acre feet to the Salton Sea.
Oh, I see.
It was not intended to be a volumetric mitigation. It was intended to address the salinity levels. That was our requirement,
I see.
is keep the salinity levels the same at the Salton Sea for 15 years while the state comes up with its plan. The sea, from an environmental
Down.
perspective, is complicated, and salinity is its biggest challenge, because
Right.
if you reach this hypersaline point, then the fish stop reproducing, and that's the food source for the birds. And so really it was protecting that bird source. The transfer exacerbated that by about 8 to 10 years based on our modeling. So we didn't do anything that wasn't going to happen anyways, but we made it happen sooner as a result of those transfers. But certainly the sea has a lot of other challenges for it, and that salinity has just been increasing on an annual basis over the years.
Right.
Every acre foot of water I mentioned has a ton of salt, and all that water that we get from the Colorado River, which is pretty salty compared to like Northern California water supplies, that all has to be leached out of the ground, and it has to go somewhere
Yeah.
in order to maintain productive agricultural land in both Imperial Valley and Coachella Valley.
So QSA kind of sped up the timeline by 8
About
to
8
10
to 10
years.
years,
Okay.
yeah.
Could you guys not keep putting water back in there, free of the agreement?
Well, we're implementing a water transfer. So we're mitigating using less water. So if you mitigate using less water with other water, that water has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
So if you're mitigating a water transfer with water, you might as well not transfer water because they cancel each other out.
Right.
So that's the challenge is if you're implementing a conservation program and you have to mitigate with waterless sources and projects because
So-
otherwise you wouldn't have the transfer. So if we were to have to mitigate with water, that would double the amount of water that was taken away from our farming community.
So when you say mitigate water, and sorry, this is like,
Yeah, that's
you
okay.
know, coming from an outside perspective, you're directing water to say like LA, but they're trying to keep their conservation efforts up by keeping the water usage down. And you're saying it would be, it wouldn't make sense to sort of match that by putting it in
Well,
the
so
Salton
the
Sea?
water that drains to the sea is excess water, more than what the crops need.
From the farm, right?
Yeah. So when we transfer water, it's based on conservation. So if a field used to use, say, 10 acre feet, the crop would use about 6 or 7 acre feet, and the balance, about a third of that water use, would run off into the Salton Sea. Our transfer programs allow that farmer to be more efficient, and instead of that 3 or 4 acre feet running off to the sea, it's only 2 acre feet running off to the sea, and that 1 acre foot that would have gone to the sea gets transferred to the urban areas. So if you had to mitigate that 1 acre foot that you transferred with an acre foot of water, where's it going to come from? So you'd have to increase your water order.
Right.
So if you're have an efficiency based transfer, you're using less water but still farming the same, you don't have any more water. Because
Right.
at the end of the day, when you do the water balance, there's only so much water.
Right. I had thought that when you said mitigation water, it is all runoff, right?
Well, no, for 15 years
That
we
you were going
delivered
to
fresh
straight.
water.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
so what we did, we were
Okay.
required to do fallowing. And if a field farmed and used 10 feet, the crop would have used 6, and we would have sent 4 to the Salton Sea. That would have occurred on its own. When we fallowed, the 6 acre feet that the crop would have used was transferred to San Diego, and the 4 acre feet that would have run off to the sea as drainage, we just directly delivered Colorado
So-
River water.
so
Our water
per-
order stayed the same.
Right. Per the agreement, you have to give that extra water.
We did for
to San
15
Diego.
years.
Okay.
And that was to allow for the state to develop its restoration plan.
Which they did.
Because the reality was when the transfer is fully implemented and the mitigation water has gone away, there's going to be 300,000 acre feet less water in the Salton Sea.
What year?
The full implementation occurs, let's see, this is the San Diego transfer is fully implemented this year for the first time.
Oh.
The Coachella piece of the transfer, which has less mitigation aspects because the water ends up draining to the sea anyways. It just
They
goes
just
to the
dump
Coachella
whatever-
system instead of our
Right.
system. That's about 3/4 of the way implemented.
Okay. So we don't have
I
a
think
hard
it's fully
year.
implemented in about 5 years.
So 2025. I'll double check that. So
I can get you those numbers.
300,000 less water.
Now that's just from these transfers. There's, the original metropolitan transfer that was executed in, I think, 1988. That transfers another 105,000 acre feet. And the mitigation at that time was different because at that time the Salton Sea was flooding. So you wouldn't be mitigating the loss of water. You were trying to reduce
Get
the
rid of
amount
it,
of water
right.
going in.
Okay.
So
Wow.
it's very tricky.
Tricky and super complicated. Okay. So to simplify it for people watching, I can say the QSA, for the first 15, you were keeping the salinity, trying to keep it the same. After 2017, the water transfer rights started to, be
So
fully
we
implemented.
converted from a fallowing requirement to efficiency based, and so we no longer had to provide mitigation water to the sea after that 15-year period. And so that's when you start to see the dramatic decline in the shoreline elevations because the impacts on the sea
Because
became
the
more
farmers aren't
significant.
putting,
Well,
they're
they
putting
still-
less
they-
runoff.
Yeah, they still have agriculture occurring, but they have less runoff because
Right.
they're more efficient now.
Because, okay, I'll say that. Conservation and efficiency sort of
So it's a
farming
good
efforts.
thing for a farmer and even, you know, urban populations to get more efficient in their water use. But the downside is that
There's
means
less
there's
runoff.
less water running off into the Salton Sea because that water instead is being transferred to other areas.
So that's from 2017 on. That was when they started getting more. Okay. So
We
it's just getting worse. Like less water is
Yeah,
coming into the
yeah.
lake. Okay. Okay.